tragic mental battle, Robin Williams. They say laughter is the best medicine. But what happens when the person who makes the whole world laugh is silently dying inside? To most of us, Robin Williams wasn't just a comedian or an actor. He was a force of energy, a whirlwind of brilliance wrapped in a smile, able to jump between characters faster than we could blink. From the genie in Aladdin to the touching teacher in Dead Poets Society, he lived 1,000 lives on screen, but the one he lived off-screen was far more complicated, far more painful, and ultimately, heartbreaking. When Robin Williams tragically passed away on August 11, 2014, the news didn't just shock the world, it shattered it. This wasn't just another celebrity headline, this was different, this was personal. Nearly every corner of social media stood still, as fans, fellow actors, and even strangers posted stories, memories, and quotes from a man they'd never met, yet felt like they knew. And yet no one truly knew the battle he had been fighting. For decades, Robin Williams had been everyone's funny man, at times almost superhuman in his improvisational genius. But behind the curtain, behind the loud laughter and the accolades, there was something eating away at the very core of his being. Few understood the depth of his suffering, not because he hid it well, but because we weren't looking for it. We weren't prepared for him to be the one hurting. You see, pain doesn't always scream, sometimes it smiles. And Robin's smile was powerful enough to hide almost anything. Born in Chicago in 1951, Robin was the only child of a senior executive at Ford and a former model. From the outside, his life looked picture-perfect. Success, wealth, a promising future. But like so many children raised in large empty homes, Robin often spoke of his loneliness. He used to talk to his toys like they were friends, not because he was imaginative, but because in reality they were his only companions. His mother, fond of humor herself, often cracked jokes during dinners. But real conversations? Those were few and far between. It was here, in this emotional vacuum, that Robin's desire to be heard first began to sprout. By high school, he had discovered that making people laugh gave him something that normal human interaction had not: attention and love. Laughter became his language, and jokes became his shield. It wasn't just a skill, it was survival. But it wasn't until his early days on television, particularly in Mork and Mindy, that the world really saw his dazzling unpredictability. Suddenly, Robin Williams was everywhere. Talk shows, comedy specials, movie sets. He could shift from impressions to Shakespeare in the same breath. Directors often let the camera roll without direction, because no one, no matter how seasoned, could predict what Robin would do next. He was chaos, controlled, beautiful chaos. And yet, behind the scenes, the struggle was growing. By the 1980s, Robin had already developed a reputation for being brilliant, but also troubled. He began using drugs and alcohol heavily. The man who seemed unstoppable on screen was steadily unraveling off it. His friend and fellow comedian John Belushi's overdose in 1982 was a slap of reality that forced Robin into rehab. But sobriety didn't fix the root of the pain. It never does, not when the ache comes from the soul. He once said, "Cocaine is God's way of telling you you're making too much money." It sounded like a joke, people laughed. But behind the clever delivery was a man crying out that success hadn't made anything better, that the fame, the money, the applause hadn't filled the silence that waited for him when the curtain dropped. Even in his most heartfelt roles, like in Good Will Hunting, where he won an Oscar, Robin was expressing something deeper than character. Many who knew him say these were moments where Robin stopped performing and started sharing, that these scenes were more therapy than theater. But if this was his cry for help, why didn't we hear it? Because Robin Williams didn't fit our idea of someone who was struggling. He was loud, animated, quick-witted, nothing like the typical image we assign to depression. And that perhaps is the most dangerous misconception of all. Before his death, Robin had been diagnosed with Parkinson's disease, something not many people knew. But what even fewer understood, perhaps not even Robin himself, was that the diagnosis wasn't completely accurate. There was something else happening in his brain, something even more complicated, and far more devastating. We'll get to that. But to understand the final chapters of Robin's story, we have to understand the deep and lonely ocean he was trying to swim through, long before anyone realized he was drowning. Despite the whirlwind of fame and admiration, there was something quietly unraveling behind Robin Williams' bright eyes, a battle hidden beneath layers of comedy, performance, and applause. This wasn't the kind of pain you could diagnose with a blood test or a brain scan. This was the relentless, suffocating ache of a man trapped within himself, someone screaming internally while making millions laugh externally. The dichotomy was staggering. In interviews, Robin often dropped cryptic hints. He would casually mention depression or joke about the dark side of his mind, brushing it off in the same breath. You have this innate belief that because someone is smiling or being funny, they're okay, he once quipped. But it's kind of like wearing clown makeup, it hides everything underneath. The audience would laugh. They always did. But if you listened beyond the rhythm of his words, if you really paid attention, you could hear the weight dragging behind every punchline. He wasn't just fighting one form of mental illness, he was fighting an army. Friends and close colleagues recall bouts of insomnia that would keep him pacing through the night, obsessive thoughts, mood swings, and a deep, almost paralyzing insecurity. For someone who made the world his stage, he rarely felt worthy of its applause. And then came the waves of self-doubt. He once admitted that there were times, even during the height of his career, when he questioned whether he'd ever work again. Imposter syndrome isn't uncommon among entertainers, but for Robin, it wasn't just an anxious thought, it was a persistent echo in his head, almost like an internal critic targeting the very thing he was best known for, his humor. Even his Oscar win in 1998, a moment of monumental validation, didn't silence the storm inside. In his acceptance speech, his voice cracked with emotion, but it wasn't joy, it was vulnerability peeking through the cracks of a man who had spent his entire life trying to prove he was enough. After the ceremony, those closest to him said he seemed distant, like he had won something the world celebrated, but he couldn't absorb it. That kind of disconnection is often missed by the public, but is all too familiar to those who battle hidden mental illnesses. And then there was the loneliness. Robin had relationships, marriages, children, friends, yet he often spoke about a feeling of detachment. It wasn't that he didn't feel love or offer it, it's just that something inside him often made it difficult to receive it, as though no matter how much affection was pointed in his direction, he couldn't fully let it in. He was in many ways a mirror. He reflected what we wanted to see. If we wanted laughter, we got it. If we asked for humility, he gave it. But when he looked into his own reflection, especially in the quiet moments, he found a man he didn't fully recognize. In 2006, Robin checked himself into rehab, not for relapse but for emotional burnout and as a form of self-care. It wasn't highly publicized at the time, but it quietly revealed the truth. Even when sober, even when healthy, Robin knew he needed help. But asking for that help, truly asking, saying it out loud to the world, remained one of the heaviest weights on his chest. By the early 2010s, the cracks began to show publicly. There were canceled gigs, lackluster press interviews, and a visible shift in his energy. Not tired, just faded. People close to him whispered concerns. Something wasn't right. His reaction time was slower. He second-guessed decisions he would have once made instantly. Lines that once flowed effortlessly on set, now, they took effort. So when the announcement came that Robin had been diagnosed with Parkinson's disease in 2014, it seemed to explain everything. The tremors, the exhaustion, the decline in sharpness. But yet again, Robin was facing something infinitely more complex than the public ever knew. What was happening inside Robin's mind was not just a decline. It wasn't just aging or even a common neurodegenerative disease. Behind the scenes, his brain was fighting him in ways that terrified him. Memory glitches, sudden fear, dizziness, panic, hallucinations. At times he would forget the purpose of an object, or become overwhelmed by simple tasks. For a man whose mind had once been his greatest strength, every moment began to feel like betrayal. His family noticed. His wife Susan Schneider-Williams later said it was like watching the light in him dim, day by day. Not just sadness, but confusion. A disoriented kind of suffering that didn't match any clear diagnosis. He would pace the halls of their home at night, whispering, "I just want to reboot my brain." At its peak, the man who once illuminated entire rooms now found it hard to get out of bed. We often talk about depression as though it lives in the shadows, but sometimes it lives in plain sight, and like a chameleon, it adapts, hides, even entertains. Robin Williams didn't seem like a man who was suffering, but he was. In truth, he was trapped inside a war that not even he fully understood, until it was too late. Robin Williams was misdiagnosed. Parkinson's disease was only a piece of the puzzle, an incorrect piece that, despite its terrifying nature, still didn't explain the full scope of his decline. By the time his autopsy was conducted, the truth came crashing down with a weight that even those closest to him weren't prepared for. Doctors discovered that Robin had been battling Lewy Body Dementia, a rare and particularly aggressive neurological disorder often dubbed the most misunderstood and misdiagnosed neurodegenerative disease on record. In fact, researchers later confirmed that Robin's case was among the worst they'd ever seen. One neurologist wrote, "No wonder he was losing his mind." Lewy body dementia is like being trapped inside a nightmare that erases pieces of you every day. It was as if his brain was being slowly rewritten by an outside force, robbing his memory, his cognition, and his grasp on reality, while still leaving enough awareness intact for him to feel the fear of what he was becoming. That's the cruelest part of Lewy body dementia. You don't fade gently, you fight for consciousness while losing your mind in front of your family's eyes. The hallucinations weren't just occasional, they were vivid, frequent, and terrifying. Robin once spoke of feeling like people were standing in the room with him when they weren't, sometimes threatening, sometimes simply watching. It felt like his world had become blurred, a place where dreams and reality collided until neither made sense. Susan, his wife, later described how Robin would experience full-blown anxiety attacks about things he couldn't even articulate. He was afraid of losing his voice, his literal and metaphorical one. He feared being humiliated professionally, forgetting his lines, or becoming a shell of himself in front of cameras. This wasn't vanity. This was a man watching his identity slip through his fingers. And perhaps that was the most harrowing part of all. Robin Williams wasn't just famous, he was functionally gifted. His speed of thought, razor-sharp wit, and ability to create multiple characters on the spot weren't just a skill, they were a lifeline. They were how he connected to the world, how he stayed afloat. And now that lifeline was fraying. There's a phrase often used by those who battle cognitive decline: "I feel like I'm here, but I'm not me anymore." Those close to Robin said this described him perfectly in the last months of his life. He became increasingly withdrawn. The man who once couldn't sit still during interviews would now pause mid-sentence, unsure of where his thought had gone. Within Hollywood circles, rumors began to build. Directors whispered about his fading energy. Some said it was age, some figured it was depression. But no one knew that Robin was losing something infinitely more precious than fame. He was losing himself, and yet his sense of humor tried to hold on. Even near the end, Robin cracked jokes, always soft, often self-deprecating. He made light of his shaking hands, he chuckled about his wobbly walk. But everyone who heard those laughs said the same thing. They didn't feel like Robin's laughter anymore. They felt like echoes, ghosts of the man everyone remembered. In one heart-wrenching moment during an evening at home, he turned to Susan and asked earnestly, "Am I losing my mind?" The silence after that question was its own kind of death. Robin never lived to hear the words Lewy body dementia applied to his condition. He passed away months before that diagnosis was confirmed. But in one tragic twist of fate, the late revelation gave something back to his family, an answer, a name for the monster he'd been fighting alone. Susan spent the next several years becoming an advocate for awareness, giving interviews, speaking with doctors, and pushing for greater research funding. Not to redeem Robin's legacy, because his legacy was already untouchable, but to make sure that no one else would have to die in confusion, feeling as though they were unraveling without reason. She once said, "Robin wasn't crazy, he was ill, and he died from a disease that only looked like depression. He was a victim, not of suicide, but of a disease that stole his brain in the most terrifying way possible. And that distinction matters. For too long, suicide is framed only as a choice. But in Robin's case, it was part of a process, one where his brilliant, powerful, world-changing mind was being broken down layer by layer. His decision wasn't impulsive, it was the result of confusion, fear, resistance, and unimaginable internal suffering. This truth doesn't erase the pain. It doesn't give fans, family, or colleagues closure, but it helps reframe his story, not as a man who gave up, but as a lion who fought an invisible beast until he couldn't. Because Robin did fight. Every day, he didn't isolate himself because he didn't care. He did it because he was trying to protect others. He didn't see doctors because he wanted answers. He did it because he believed there was a way to fix what was going wrong. He didn't confide in many because he didn't want to be seen broken. For someone whose career was built on effortless brilliance, vulnerability in real life was suffocating. And when the world mourned Robin's death, perhaps few knew that the man we thought had everything was quietly fighting a disease so brutal, not even he understood what it was doing to him. Robin Williams spent his entire life trying to lift others out of their darkest moments, whether it was through his larger-than-life characters, his spontaneous humor, or those rare tender roles where his vulnerability shone through. He gave people hope. And yet, as we've come to learn, he was pouring from a cup that was quietly, tragically running dry. This begs the question, how could someone who brought so much light to the world be left to battle in such darkness alone? The truth is, we often romanticize brilliance. We assume that talent and charisma are enough to shield someone from despair, that if a person is successful, funny, or beloved, they must be okay. But that's the illusion Robin's life exposed. His story proves that genius does not guarantee peace, and that sometimes the brightest lights are battling the darkest shadows. Even within Hollywood, where eccentricity and emotion are commonplace, Robin still stood apart, not just for his talent, but for his empathy. Countless stories emerged after his death, moments when he went out of his way to help a crew member, comfort a nervous actor, donate to a fan's medical treatment, or write letters to strangers struggling with grief or illness. His kindness wasn't performative, it was a natural extension of a man who felt everything deeply, and that perhaps is the root of his paradox. Robin wasn't just expressive because it made him a good comedian, he was expressive because his way of surviving was through connection. He absorbed people's pain like a sponge. He listened, he reflected, he poured out joy as a kind of offering, even when he had very little left for himself. But when someone becomes everyone else's safe space, they often don't have one of their own. That isolation, the quiet, gnawing loneliness of being the strong one, the funny one, the healer, eventually became unbearable. Behind the rapid-fire impressions and the witty comebacks was a man who longed to be understood, not through applause but through silence, through stillness, through honesty, and yet he often denied himself those very things. One of his closest friends once said, "The irony about Robin was that even his breakdowns came with a punchline." That was his defense mechanism. If he could package his pain inside a joke, it felt safer to himself and to those around him. But psychological defense mechanisms, no matter how clever, eventually crack under pressure, especially when the cracks are being widened by something as insidious as Lewy Body Dementia. Robin once said that the only time he felt truly free was on stage, that for those brief moments when he was lost in characters, sketching absurd routines out of thin air, he forgot about the pressure. He forgot about the noise in his head. But near the end, even that therapeutic stage began to betray him. Scripts that would have once been memorized in hours required repetition, notes, and physical effort. His timing, once so precise it seemed divine, started to falter. Then came the guilt. He knew people were counting on him, directors, audiences, even his family. And when he couldn't show up as the version of Robin they remembered, he felt he was letting everyone down. That guilt became a secondary illness, one that magnified his insecurities, fed his anxiety, and eventually convinced him that maybe people would be better off without him. That's what depression does. It doesn't just lie, it isolates. It builds walls that hide every open door. It convinces even the most loved human beings that their presence is a burden. To this day, one of the most heart-wrenching things fans remember was how normal Robin seemed just weeks before his death. He was seen riding his bike, taking photos with fans, joking in passing conversations. But there were signs. He appeared thinner, more fatigued, less engaged, and while the world brushed it off as age or stress, he was preparing himself for goodbye, not in a dramatic way, not with some grand gesture, but in the quiet, deliberate withdrawal of a man carrying unbearable weight. Susan later revealed that Robin began giving away items he valued, gifts he'd kept for decades, personal jokes, sentimental trinkets, quietly handed off without explanation. At the time it seemed random. In retrospect, it was farewell. When he passed, there was no note, no explanation, simply an exit. And in that stillness, the entire world let out a collective gasp. It was as though happiness itself had died. But what many didn't realize is that this wasn't the story of a man losing to weakness. It was the story of a man losing to a misunderstood illness, masked by complex symptoms and hidden from even those who loved him most. Robin didn't fail. Lewy Body Dementia did. And in the absence of a proper diagnosis, it claimed its most unsuspecting victim, the spark that lit up our screens for 4 decades. There's a lesson here, a painful, urgent one. That silence isn't always peace, that smiling isn't always joy, that even clowns cry when the curtain closes, alone in the shadows. And maybe, just maybe, if we listen closer next time, we won't have to lose another brilliant soul to the silence. After Robin Williams' death, tributes flooded in from every corner of the globe. Presidents, comedians, fans, movie stars, and everyday people shared what his life had meant to them. It wasn't the usual media cycle of celebrity mourning. This was different. It was personal. It felt like we had lost a friend, one who had been with us in childhood, through heartbreaks, through laughter, during our loneliest nights and our most joyful moments. Because Robin didn't just play roles, he connected. With children, adults, the broken-hearted, the dreamers, the lonely, the outcasts, he made us laugh until we cried, and cry until we healed. And yet, as the world celebrated the joy he gave, the grief was mixed with a sharp, painful question: how did we not know? How did a man so visible, so deeply loved, feel isolated enough to crumble in silence? It's a question that haunts his fans, and one that exposes the deep disconnect society has with mental health, especially when it doesn't fit a familiar image. We picture depression as sadness, tears, maybe quiet desperation, but rarely do we look for it in charisma, in over-energy, in the person who goes out of their way to make others feel okay even when they themselves are not. Robin Williams was the embodiment of that paradox, someone flooded with empathy, yet incapable of truly asking for help for himself. His death prompted something rare, a global dialogue about depression and mental illness. For once, late-night hosts weren't just delivering jokes, they were opening up. Celebrities spoke candidly about their own struggles. People tweeted not just condolences but personal admissions. It was as if Robin's departure cracked open a dam of collective silence. But as the headlines began to fade, so did the conversation. Because awareness without change is temporary. And while Robin's name became associated with laughter, it should also be remembered as a lesson, a wake-up call about how we view mental illness, neurodegenerative disease, and the flawed expectation that fame and fortune somehow protect us from human pain. Lewy Body Dementia, the invisible villain in Robin's story, is still horribly misunderstood. It's often misdiagnosed as Parkinson's, Alzheimer's, or general mental decline. Most victims endure years of confusion before doctors even utter its name. There is no cure, no single treatment, and for many, no warning before it rips into their lives. But it's not just the science that matters, it's the silence. Robin's tragedy reminds us that checking on someone isn't about waiting for them to reach out. It's about paying attention when their light dims, even slightly. It's about noticing the friend who cracks too many jokes to avoid real conversation. It's about saying, "How are you really?" when everyone else is content with "fine." Because that's the reality of mental illness, it's rarely loud. It hides behind routines, responsibilities, and even celebrity glamour. Especially in men, where emotional suppression is still expected, vulnerability often arrives too late. Robin himself was raised on this mindset. He once said, "You're only given a little spark of madness, you mustn't lose it." But what if you can't control which parts of yourself are fading? That quote gained heartbreaking significance after his passing. That spark of madness, that beautiful untamed ability to think sideways and feel deeply, was both his magic and eventually his undoing. In the years since, Robin's family has continued speaking out, not just to preserve his legacy, but to educate others who might be facing similar stories. Susan's essays about his final year are chilling for their insight, but also deeply compassionate. She wrote, "My best friend was sinking, and he didn't understand why. Neither did the world. We need to do better." And she's right. We do. We've built a culture that obsessively celebrates talent while ignoring the trauma that often fuels it. We adore artists when they're creating for us, but fall silent when they ask for help. We platform their genius but silence their grief. Robin's story invites us to change that, to stop equating visibility with invincibility. Not everyone's suffering will let it show. Not every cry for help comes in the form of a breakdown. Sometimes, it's a whisper, a tremor, a shadow in the eyes of someone who's used to making you feel better. And maybe the most profound way we can honor Robin Williams isn't just by rewatching Mrs. Doubtfire, or quoting Dead Poets Society, or playing Aladdin for our kids. It's by embracing the idea that mental health needs more than awareness, it needs action. Robin Williams left behind more than just memorable performances. He left behind a legacy of light, laughter, and questions we're still trying to answer. Even now, years after his death, people continue to discover his work for the first time, revisit his films for the 100th, and find solace in his words like echoes from a wiser, softer soul than most of us realized at the time. And that's where his power remains, in the reverberation of joy he brought to others, even on the days he had none left for himself. Some find it difficult to reconcile the two images, the playful, charismatic comedian, and the man tormented privately by declining cognition, depression, and a misunderstood disease slowly unraveling his mind. But maybe that contrast is exactly why his story matters so much, because it's in that tension between light and dark that we find the truth about humanity itself. Robin's story isn't just tragic, it's instructive. He taught us that helping others doesn't mean you're not hurting, that laughter can be a bridge or a disguise, that even the most outwardly joyful people may be carrying burdens so heavy they can't put them into words. He taught us that vulnerability isn't weakness, it's courage disguised as honesty. He taught us that mental health, neurodiversity, and neurological disorders don't always look the way we expect them to. They don't follow a script. They don't arrive with clarity or leave with closure. Sometimes they're shapeless monsters, creeping quietly into the minds of the people we admire the most. And most importantly, he taught us what love looks like even in the face of suffering. Because Robin loved deeply. His family, his friends, his fans, the world. That love never faded. even as the disease progressed. It was there in the way he tried to protect others from his pain. It was there in the gifts he quietly gave away before the end. It was there in every role he chose to take. Roles that didn't just entertain but meant something. John Keating in Dead Poets Society, who taught students to think for themselves. Sean Maguire in Good Will Hunting, who listened without judgment. Patch Adams, who believed healing begins with joy. Even the genie in Aladdin, who ultimately just wanted to be free. Each part was more than a performance. It was an expression of something Robin believed the world needed more of: connection, compassion, forgiveness, freedom. And yet through all of this, he never saw himself as extraordinary. In fact, that may be the most painful truth of all. A man capable of lifting millions never fully believed he was enough. He once said in an interview, "I used to think the worst thing in life is to end up all alone. It's not. The worst thing is to end up with people who make you feel alone." Now looking back, it sounds less like a quote and more like a confession. Because for all the cameras and cheers and red carpets, Robin's truest pain may have been feeling unseen in the moments when he needed to be understood the most. It's fitting, then, that his death sparked one of the most intensive global conversations about mental health ever seen in modern media, and though that spark flickered for some, it's still burning in the hearts of people who remember him, not just as a performer but as a human being who deserved gentleness, clarity, and peace. So what do we do now? We remember, we educate, we listen, we check in on the strong ones, we look past the jokes and into the silences. We remove the shame from the conversation. We fund the research. We normalize therapy. We show compassion where assumptions once lived. And we speak about Robin not in hushed tones or tragic overtones, but in celebration, in awe, in gratitude. Because yes, his ending was heartbreaking, but his life was beautiful, complex, unfinished in 1,000 ways, but beautiful. And strangely, in mourning him, we found a new kind of connection to ourselves, to one another, and to the sacred truth that every life holds a mix of joy and pain, brilliance and burden. Robin Williams showed us how to embrace that paradox, how to live in it, even when it hurts, how to find the funny, even when the world feels like it's collapsing. It's easy to say we lost him too soon, but maybe people like Robin aren't meant to stay long. Maybe their light burns so bright that it simply wasn't meant to last forever. Maybe their purpose isn't just to make us laugh, but to teach us how to care for each other once the laughter fades. So thank you, Robin, for the joy, for the honesty, for the tears you gave us, not just the kind you caused, but the kind you understood. You may be gone, but your echo remains, in punchlines, in stillness, and in every heart that ever needed someone to say, "It's okay to not be okay." Oh, Captain, my Captain, rest peacefully. We'll keep listening.